Good afternoon, and welcome to the Voice of Wisdom. With over 60 years of experience as an investment banker, entrepreneur, investment analyst, economist, and venture capitalist, Morty Davis is Wall Street and capitalism personified. The over 400 companies for which he has raised more than $3 billion over the years have created a countless number of jobs and exciting new products. Through the Voice of Wisdom, Mr. Davis explores, analyzes, and debates the most topical political, economic, and social issues facing our world today. Joining Mr. Davis today for a discussion on the Israeli Supreme Court and judicial system is Len Carter. Len is an experienced investment banker, private investor, and business consultant. And now, Mr. Carter and Mr. Davis.
Welcome back, my wonderful guests, my co-podcasters. You were all involved. I love you all because you send me such incisive messages every week. I learn more from you than I learned from all the reading that I do. So God bless you and thank you. And tonight I'm delighted to have on one of the great people, Jack Carter. He's fabulous, he's brilliant, he's top of his class at Harvard Business School. He's a genius, and we're all lucky to have his wisdom. So tonight we're talking about the Supreme Court of Israel, as well as the Supreme Court of the United States, and the implications, because Israel's been going through a terrible upheaval with the masses, many of the people there upset with Bibi Netanyahu, with the prime minister, for his trying to change the nature of the Supreme Court in Israel. And I don't know why they're so upset, because I think the way they appoint their Supreme Court is outrageous. Only two out of 14 people that pick the Supreme Court justices in Israel, only 2 are elected officials. 2 members of the Knesset, of the parliament, are the ones that choose. Three of them are members of the Supreme Court themselves, so they're not even choosing. They're not selecting based on their capacity or the good work they're doing. It's because they have that important job, so they're going to vote for themselves. So at least in the United States, we select our Supreme Court justices through elected officials. The President of the United States proposes, and the Congress, particularly the Senate, disposes. In other words, he would recommend, the President would recommend some qualified, somebody he thinks is very qualified, and should be, because it's one of the most important positions in our government, in our whole democracy. And then the Senate can either determine that that person is qualified and his reputation is up beyond criticism, and so they're selected by elected officials. Many of you don't realize it's not so long ago that the way our successor to the United States president was chosen was the following. If the president got sick or died or couldn't serve for some reason, then the vice president was next in line and would become acting president. And then after the vice president, the secretary of state was next, the secretary of treasury was next, I think the Secretary of Defense was next. None of those people were elected. So they changed it. They finally figured it out that it's not right that somebody that the president chooses for his cabinet become the successors rather than some elected officials. So today it goes, it's the vice president, then it's the Speaker of the House, and then it's the majority leader of the Senate, and so forth, all of whom are elected officials. So we assign a greater responsibility and accountability to people that are elected than people that are chosen to serve under the president's wishes. So what's the basis on which the United States Supreme Court makes its determination? They look to the originators of the Constitution, our forefathers, the Constitution of the United States, and they read it, and if it's covered in some way, if it's not covered, they try to decipher what the Constitution is trying to say, what our forefathers intended, and then they rule on that basis. In Israel, as I said, the 14 people that select, only 2 are elected officials. And the way, since Israel has no constitution, maybe that's something they should produce post haste. So they can't look to the Constitution. So their basis is of the decision is reasonableness. If they feel it's unreasonable, they reject what the elected officials, what the parliament, what the Israeli parliament is called, the Knesset, what the Knesset legislated, and if they think it's unreasonable, in their minds not reasonable, they reject it. And they have the last say above the elected officials. Now, to me, that's kind of ridiculous and really, in a way, outrageous, because what's reasonable to one group of lawyers and in general any group of people is open to their own backgrounds, their own inclinations. There's not universal agreement as to what's reasonable. The right wing in the United States and the religious Christians, very religious Christians, think you have to be pro-life. That's reasonable. And the people, the vast majority of Americans up to now, for the last 50 years, have felt that the woman should have a choice whether she should give birth or end end her pregnancy, either because she feels she can't take care of children, or she feels that it's a bad marriage that she has, and she doesn't want to bring a child into her life with a husband that she's ready to leave, or he's ready to leave her, or for any number of reasons, or for health reasons even. So what's reasonable is that term, that reason, that method of determining what the Supreme Court should rule is outrageous. And I believe Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has reason to change that. Maybe they should all be elected Supreme Court justices, as many judges in the United States are. They're put up for election, and they're chosen by a vote of the majority. So maybe he's gone about it the wrong way because he happens to be under indictment, and a lot of the population apparently believes then maybe he's just trying to change it to avoid being found guilty or imprisoned or whatever. But it needs to be definitely updated, reviewed. As I said, either Israel has to develop a constitution just as we did initially in the United States, or they should all be elected so we know, and there should be term limits, so we should know that they are chosen by a majority of the people, and it shouldn't be just based on reasonableness, it should be based on some underlying document like a constitution. I don't want to take the whole hour, and I want to get the benefit of the wisdom of our brilliant guest. So, Mr. Carter, would you please give me your views and see if you agree with anything that I said or disagree or even have better insights than I had.
Thanks for having me on. So I think that first there's two issues that I think we can separate and discuss in parts. The first is how the High Court is selected, and the second is what powers should they have. So the first part is how they're selected, and today I agree with you that it's crazy that the 15 people, of the 14, I thought it was 15 because they have an odd number to get a majority, otherwise they'd have a split. Whatever it is, only two out of the people who select the judges are elected from our Knesset members.
I'm talking about the people, the number of people on the selection committee are 14.
There's a 14? Okay.
I don't know how many just the Supreme Court.
I think there's 15. Maybe that's where I'm getting confused.
Yeah, okay.
So the selection committee, I agree 100%. It's crazy that 12 of the 14 are either other members of the court. I think 3 of the court votes on the court. That's kind of circular.
3 Supreme Court
That's circular.
members.
And then a few others are bar members of the bar, and others are cabinet members. And so it's basically non-elected people. So that I would agree that should be changed. It either should be
I think two of them may be members of the cabinet.
cabinet, but only two.
But those aren't elected.
Right, only 2 out of the 14 are Knesset members, which are elected. So that I agree, that doesn't sit well with me. So either direct election, like as a possibility, or similar to how we do it, where there's a nomination and a confirmation process. Either way, it's through elected officials and not.
Right.
Although you could say that, I mean, if in the same way we do it, if Netanyahu picks cabinet people as Supreme Court members, that's the same concept that a president nominating a Supreme Court justice and then having the Senate confirm. In that case, they're not elected either. They're selected by people who were elected.
No, most of the people on our Supreme Court are not elected officials.
That's what I'm saying. So that's why.
But I'm saying at least they're selected and voted on by the most important person that's elected, the president, and
Right.
and the most important legislative body.
The Senate.
So they are
Right. So
chosen by our.
So in Israel, that's not the case, because even the people who were selected by elected people is only the cabinet. Because
No, not the cabinet. The only 2 elected people
No,
are
the
the
only-
2 members of the cabinet.
I'm saying that they're selected by elected people, right? Because the cabinet was selected
Yeah.
by the elected
But
people.
we're not dealing with the cabinet. We're dealing with the Supreme Court justices.
But 2 of the Supreme Court justices are people that were from.
Yeah, but they
Netanyahu.
weren't.
They were
they weren't-
selected by him.
Right.
So that's like our president selecting.
Well, that's
selecting.
like what we had before, that the president
Right.
chose sequence of serving if in the event that our elected president was unable to serve, either because he was sick or disabled or passed
But
away.
I think
So-
a better
so
approach for Israel.
They changed it to people that were elected instead of before.
Right. So I agree that I think the best way for Israel and for us, we'll get to that later as we discuss lessons we can learn from Israel's situation, would be direct election and term limit and a retirement term, because then the court would more reflect the views of the population if it were direct elected. Right. But the second part, from how the court's selected, is what powers should they have, and that I think.
On what basis should they rule?
Right.
On what basis should
right.
they rule?
What should what powers and checks and balances should they have?
We have it clear. The Supreme Court justices presumably don't make laws, don't
They
introduce
don't. They just interpret.
So they're there to derive what the Constitution.
They interpret the Constitution.
The Constitution is like their Bible.
Yep.
And they're not changing it. There's ways to change it, but it takes a great deal of effort.
Right.
I think 3/4 of the states have to.
Yes, supermajority in Congress. Yes, yes. But the issue that I wrestle with, and I don't really have an answer, but I can understand why people would be upset with the reasonableness law being eliminated, is that it does eliminate that check and balance that I believe all good governments should have, that there should be some check and balance between the legislative side and the judicial side. Because if you don't have that, then what's stopping the legislature from enacting laws which aren't good or aren't consistent with the laws of the country? Now, in Israel's case,
in our country, in the U.S., the Supreme Court, if they introduce something that's not right, presumably we're saying our view of the Constitution is that they were so brilliant that they envisioned every situation that could occur. They argued over it, and it evolved, and we're accepting it as like God, from God. That's the law. Now, it's still, they're human beings, and
still open to interpretation. Yes, yeah, what's free speech, right. What is and isn't.
So,
yes. But at least they have something to point to.
They still can introduce their biases. But
they have something that they're working from.
Yeah.
So in Israel, they don't have a constitution, but they have these 13 basic laws.
No, they have the reasonableness. That's
but they do have they have 13 basic laws and case law, other precedences and things that they work from. So what I would ponder, I don't have the answer to this, but how can you put a system in place which has checks and balances, because I do think that's necessary, but still have it not be arbitrary? So I agree that this reasonableness idea is not great, because what defines reasonableness? Yeah. But
look,
but having nothing at all, I think, is equally bad, because nothing has no check and balance. So what do you do?
No, if they were elected, that would be the check and balance.
So elected, and then could they
could override
based on whatever a reasonableness test if they're elected?
I guess, but
I mean that's a potential solution,
our
because
also,
at least it would reflect what reasonableness is defined by the electorate.
We're finding clearly that the Supreme Court has become, notwithstanding the approach that we thought following the Constitution, it's become politicized. In other words, when the majority are right-wing Republicans, they're going to interpret the Constitution
absolutely
in a way that coincides with their views.
But if they were all elected, that wouldn't happen. but they'd still be biased toward their own views. It would
Yeah.
just be reflective of the electorate, because
Well,
they'd be
even-
elected.
Even then, there could be an approach where you say it has to be roughly no more than 5-4. In other words, if there are 6 members of the Congress, of the Supreme Court, that are from one party, or will have a record of being politically influenced by the ideals of one party, which we all know when we go to vote which party, what their ideas are. They tell us what their platform is going to be. So we could say we'd never want to be so unbalanced. It could be, 5-4 in either direction, but no more than that. So you make it sort of more balanced, so it becomes less political.
Right.
Right now it's very political because 6 are very right wing, and 3 are sort of neutral or maybe even left.
But doing what they're doing now without making your changes,
Yeah.
because I think your changes would address a
Right.
lot of the issues. But in the absence of making those changes, doing what they're doing now, which is eliminating that veto, if you will, that reasonableness veto, I think, is not great, because it does eliminate a necessary check and balance. Because then there's no check and balance against
Which eliminates it.
doing what they're doing now, which is passing this the reasonableness bill that was passed on Monday says they can no longer, overrule legislation because it's unreasonable.
Yeah, no,
If you do that,
I
if
just think that's outrageous, because what's reasonable to one person.
So it's either way, it's not good, because on one hand, it's what you say, and I agree. What's reasonable to one person's not reasonable
Right.
to another. That's
Even in
not
our-
good. I
Even
agree.
in our Supreme Court.
But I think it's equally bad to have nothing.
No, I said that definitely, they got.
So what do you do?
I just told you. You either develop a constitution.
All right, try developing a
About that?
constitution in any
Okay.
country, let alone Israel.
Okay, you're right. Where
See,
there's
a
two
lot of
Jews-
those things.
Right, where there's 2 Jews, there's 3 opinions.
Yeah,
You're
so
right.
where there's 2 constitutions, there's going to be 3 opinions on a constitution. But, so that unfortunately,
hopefully
that
they
ship
could
may
have-
have sailed.
that's
The
one
time to do a
approach.
constitution is when, in 1948, when you set up the country, in the beginning, like we did in 1770, whenever.
So then.
Okay,
then
that
the-
ship has sailed. Now you got to, I think the elected officials, elected judges would help, and then you need maybe you change the wording so that it's not reasonableness, but it's consistent with existing law that are on the books. Because the country does have existing laws. It has laws, and it has case law from precedent cases. So if the Supreme Court elected had to, would use that as their guidelines. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. I don't think
No,
there's any
but-
way to come up with
With human
perfect, but you
beings,
have
it's
to.
never perfect.
I just think you have to do this. The question, from, if you're Netanyahu, though, he's facing a lot of criticism. What, you had said before, his mistake was not getting out in front of this and saying, I'm
explaining
proposing
that.
to do it this
It's-
way, and I have a model called the United
Right.
States.
He could say, he should have come on and say, the way we have it now is very arbitrary. It's reasonableness it's unreasonable to me what they're doing, but it's reasonable to them. There's no, that's not a solid enough approach. So he should have gone on and said, we are a democracy like the United States. The United States is the number 1 democracy in the world. And I want to replicate exactly what the United States has. So in the United States, the president, the leader of the country, selects the next, whoever, when the time comes to fill that seat, that Supreme Court seat, the president proposes somebody and the Senate disposes. In other words, they make up their mind, and if they feel it's inappropriate, they rejected it. Look, they rejected a guy who was very qualified because he was not consistent with the desire of the Republican Party at that time being a time when the Senate was majority ruled by, what's his name, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. So they said he can't appoint the president can't appoint the new Chief Justice, Supreme Court Justice, because it's so close to the end of his tenure as a president.
Let the people decide.
It's 11 months to go. Let the people. So, but then 3 years later, when the Republicans had a chance to appoint somebody, and there was only like 2 months left, they approved a justice who was Republican. So it shows you, there's so much arbitrariness.
Right.
When you're dealing with human beings, you're never going to make anything perfect.
The smart thing, the mistake the Democrats made in 2016 was not realizing they might lose. They never thought they would lose, and they thought, we'll just have Hillary appoint the next judge, so we'll let it slide. The Republicans in 2020 knew we might lose this one, and so they got the judge approved.
So that was
smart.
They don't want to take a chance, right?
So they were smarter. I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think both parties learned lessons. They're not going to do that anymore. But I think unless the president and the Senate are the same party going forward, I don't think we're going to get judges confirmed. Because I think the next time a president and a Senate are of opposite parties, I think they're just going to stalemate. I don't think they're going to. I think it's become so politicized and polarized that, unlike it used to be, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a liberal, she was confirmed by a very wide majority of the Senate because the Senate used the criteria they're supposed to use, which is this person qualified to be a Supreme Court justice? In her case, the answer was yes, very much so.
I think she got a unanimous vote.
It was very, very high. But not like you got now, where it's right down the middle on party lines.
And also when the Senate interviews these candidates that are proposed, the candidates lie. Because they said, they testified, we believe in precedent, we're not going to change precedent. And they asked them about Roe Wade particularly, which has been a big issue for the Republicans, for many of the Republicans, pro-life. They asked them, well, what about pro-life? What about pro-choice? They said, well, it's been on the books 50 years. We believe in precedent, and we're not going to get the Democrats to go along. They said, we're not going to use that. We're not going to just ignore precedent. And the minute it came up, the minute they had an opportunity to vote on it, precedent was irrelevant. They eliminated something that for 50 years was working, and in effect, they gave the election, they elected Biden rather than Biden winning because he was so popular. The thing that even Kansas, which is a very pro-life state and very conservative state, voted overwhelmingly against the Republicans after that because women, which represent at least half or about half of the overwhelmingly changed, even the ones that were conservative overwhelmingly voted against the Republicans for doing that, or for knowing that they will continue to prohibit them from having abortions even when they felt strongly that they should have it. So the Supreme Court elected the Democrats
In 2022, yeah.
in 22
Yeah.
when
They
presumably
they prevented the red wave.
right. Historically, the interim after the election, 2 years after the election of the president, the other party wins
A lot.
of the.
They won some. I mean, they got
Wins
the
it.
House back, but not what they thought that you would normally get in
Yeah.
that situation.
No, they were supposed to get an overwhelming
Huge amount.
majority, and
They didn't even, and the Senate became even more, right? They got the Democrats got one more seat in the Senate.
Yeah.
So it was not what they thought. That's true. So let's talk about this. What do you do?
There's also one thing that's very annoying. I forget if it's with the judge or with. I just read it again. If one senator objects, just one senator, well, I forget what issue that is, the person can be appointed. Just one senator. In other words, it's not a majority, it's not a,
Appointed where?
I forget what issue it was, whether it's for a judge or for, I gotta look that up. But it's so outrageous. It's gotta be one senator, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And if he objects to an appointment,
It's like a criminal trial. It has to be unanimous. So,
it's unanimous by that one person.
yeah. So, let's talk about this. One of the things you see going on in Israel now is a lot of protests against, this controversial bill. The reservists saying they're not going to fight, doctors saying they're not going to go to work. So it's a civil disobedience kind of question, but what is that right? And if it's not, what's the right way, if that's not it, to protest something like this that people may feel strongly against?
Well, I think you can't not serve in the military because Israel is always under threat. And by doing that, they may be inviting
Right,
some other nation
right. I was
or some other
wondering,
group of nations to attack them. And so I don't think you can allow that. They could announce that they won't, but they can't actually implement that. I don't know what they could do about doctors, because doctors are free, private sector individuals in a country, I guess, could get along as we do with less doctors than are truly needed. We do it all the time. We
Yeah.
even have barriers to more doctors so that their incomes could stay high.
it's not like 1981 or 2 when Reagan fired the air traffic workers for going on strike. You can't fire your Army reservists. You can't, maybe there's some doctors who are employed by the state who you could fire.
That took a lot of guts, because I was worried. I thought it was the right thing, because they were getting out of line. And he also taught unions a lesson, you can't just strike against, it used to be you couldn't strike, government employees couldn't strike. And then they changed that,
Well, essential certain workers can't,
Yeah.
right? Police can't, firefighters can't.
I don't know, is that true?
Yeah,
Because I think the police often threaten that they're
well,
going
they do, but I don't think they're technically allowed to.
No, it's very destructive. It's,
And it does pose a national security threat potentially.
yeah.
So it's a, it's a
I don't know
it's
how
a very
to-
tough, difficult issue
I don't know
because you
how
don't want to
it's-
cave.
yeah,
I mean,
I
if you're
don't know.
Netanyahu, what do you do? Do you
Well, he said
run the
he's-
risk? Do you
he
take the
says he's
risk? Do
open
you-
to- He
you
says
know,
he's
or-
open to discussion. I don't know what that means. Because it's also, there's a lot of underlying issues because it has to do with the secular population and the religious population.
Yes.
And the religious population says, look, the true Jews are the religious people. The secular, they were born Jewish, but they're not really committed, so they shouldn't have as big a voice. So they're unhappy that the laws are made overwhelmingly by the Orthodox rabbis. And
Netanyahu needs those support in his government.
Yeah,
He needs the right wing support.
absolutely,
So-
absolutely.
He has to pander to them to some degree, even if he.
Yeah, but it always becomes, or that doesn't always, but the political is very, very important. So here's an issue where the secular can assert their views and sort of push forcefully for their views. Because if they get the army to go along and critical parts of the population to go along, the prime minister and the Knesset has to be aware that they could
Yeah,
be,
I mean,
they could be thrown out.
Whatever Prime Minister Netanyahu's willingness to negotiate, whatever he's saying he'll do, he should do it quickly, because you don't want your enemies to see, any sort of
Yeah, but
schism
when
in
you
your.
say
in
you
your-
negotiate, the other side got to be willing to come to negotiate, and I'm not sure. It's just like with Ukraine and Putin and Zelensky. Zelensky says, "I'm not negotiating. There's no negotiation."
Until you leave.
Yeah, and give back even
Yes.
what you took years ago.
So the
What's that part of the
Crimea.
Crimea?
Crimea, the peninsula that they took
Yeah.
a few years ago, yeah. Yeah, you're
It's
right.
interesting that it starts with CRIME.
Crime. Full disclosure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's their view may be we're not going to negotiate because until you agree not to rescind what
Yeah.
you took away,
Yeah.
and then you're at a real
Yeah,
stalemate.
When somebody is not, there's no room to negotiate. We want you to drop it, and he
Yeah.
says,
I mean, that's why some say that for as strong as Netanyahu, is when he gets stuff like this passed, it shows he's kind of weak because all these other groups are, he can't get everybody together
Yeah.
to do something.
look, 35 members of the Knesset
Yeah, walked out.
didn't, yeah. But he won 65-0, which is pretty impressive. That's almost 2/3. Just one short of 2/3. It's not an easy, usually after a deed is done, it quiets down. So far it hasn't, and we'll see if it does. I mean, it's,
Right, his idea.
and on top of that, last week, just the week before this whole thing came to a head, he fell down, hit his head. It turned out that he
Pacemaker.
had a heart episode, and they did some minor operation, and then they put in a pacemaker. So it wasn't the ideal time. It was a miracle that he was able to be around and serve and mobilize the Knesset to pass the law. But you got to get this resolved one way or the other.
So what is the U.S. Two parts? First, like what should the U.S. do as far as response to what was going on there? Should they take a stand supporting one side or another? Should they stay out of it? Should we
I am always of the view that we shouldn't intrude in in other countries' behavior, unless it affects us dramatically. And to use the support that we give to Israel financially and militarily to get him to change his approach on the Supreme Court is, I think, out of line.
Well,
I don't think it's Biden's role to do it, just as I would object if Israel made some recommendation as to what the United States should do. They did about Iran. They said, don't make that deal, and the United States did it anyway. But it was like war also. We get involved in civil wars of other countries. Look, we care about people dying, but we can't be the judge and the jury of every country in the world, and the policeman and the morality conscience of the world. That's why we're so involved in so many wars and military involvements, because we do get involved. We in countries where we have no real right to introduce, even intrude, even with something like Taiwan. We're ready to go to war to make sure Taiwan doesn't become part of China. They say also, well, if China took over Taiwan, Taiwan has the most chips or the most semiconductor important to us, so we can't let them take it over. That's tough that we didn't prepare for that, but that's no reason. And who says the Chinese have always sold us important parts of what we need? So that's just an excuse. And anyway, we're trying to correct that, because one of the good things that Biden did is, for essential products, we got to make sure we are in control of what we need, because it shouldn't depend on anybody. For the little things that Walmart sells or Lowe's sells or Home Depot sells, I think 99% of those products we don't need to necessarily manufacture, but it's things related to medicine or military that we do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic no-win situation, because the U.S., if the U.S. comes out and supports the Netanyahu in his repealing this reasonable bill, then there are people who, the protesters, are unhappy, and even doing nothing, even not supporting, saying nothing, like you were saying, just no comment is a comment, because then you're, by not saying anything, are you not supporting the prime minister? Yeah. So it's I'm glad I'm not. This is another example of why I'm glad I'm not the president.
Prime Minister Begin, I forget who was president,
Clinton, maybe.
But was threatened likewise. And Begin said, don't threaten us. We'll survive with or without. We'll sacrifice our lives. We'll do whatever we have to, because we can't be dependent on anybody. We were during the Holocaust, and nobody stood up to help us, and now we know we have to survive, and we can't be pushed to do things that we feel are contrary to our country's interests. And some people say that Netanyahu should stick to his guns if he feels that he's doing the right thing. What else did we have on our agenda?
Then I guess we can, now that we've not resolved the Israeli problem, we can ask what lessons can we learn from that, their turmoil and situation to apply here to our Supreme Court, which I think we talked a little bit about. One might be, if we could, although again, it's very difficult because it would require an amendment to the Constitution, changing the way we select our justices.
No, what we should learn from this is our Supreme Court should do what's reasonable. Because they don't do a lot of things that in my view, are unreasonable. So, and in the view of many Democrats, almost half the population, or more than half or less than half, think are unreasonable. So it's ridiculous, the idea of reasonable, but we like to believe that they're sincere and they're apolitical when they promise to serve, and then they become very political. A guy like Thomas hasn't voted for one thing in his whole tenure, and he's been there about 40 years or more? How long is Thomas?
30 maybe.
30?
Like early 1990, I think he was appointed, somewhere around there.
Really? So 10 and 23, 35 years or something.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, his idea of reasonable is what he does. And as a matter of fact, there's a big issue now with the fact that every other group, including senators, congressmen, the president, and all judges are subject to ethical standards. The Supreme Court doesn't want to introduce ethical standards. They want to be above the law. I mean, they're getting such a bad reputation to have a popularity in the polls, I think, below a used car salesman or something, just as most politicians historically in Congress have had very low esteem.
I think it's more likely that we could change the number of justices on the court before we could change the way they're selected. Because the way they're selected, I believe, is a constitutional process.
I don't think so.
And the number of justices is determined by law. So
I don't think the Constitution
specifies how it's done.
I don't know. I don't think.
Maybe not. I don't know. If it's not, then you can legislate that the same way you can legislate the number of. I know the number of justices is set by the Congress.
But even Roosevelt, who was very popular,
but that
couldn't.
But it's a lot easier to do that than it is to change the Constitution. Change the Constitution.
No, but I'm saying he couldn't increase the size of the. Because it's all political. It has nothing to do with what works better. It's just like.
But in terms of reaching
Mitch McConnell did, it's not following the law. Following when it suited his purpose, he said the president is lame duck. He might as well resign a year before, because if he's totally lame duck, he can't enact things. So he proposes a guy who's qualified. It's not that they said he wasn't qualified. Mitch McConnell wouldn't even bring him up for a vote. That's how bad it was. At least they brought him up and the Senate rejected him, that's one thing. But I don't know if at that time the Republicans even had a majority. Did they have a majority? I think he must have.
They did, because he was head of the majority party, so they had to have a majority. But I think, in terms of reaching thresholds, it would be the reason that happened was because there was a different party in the Senate than the president. I think if you had, a stronger majority in both houses, then you might be able to change the number of justices on the court.
To that extent, I like the British system better, because the party that gets in really controls.
By definition,
all- Yeah.
by definition, can get stuff done, because they got in.
Yeah, no.
Well, that's like
they have a
Netanyahu.
majority. They have a
He had-
majority.
That's
right.
where his 64 votes came from.
Right.
His coalition.
They have a majority, so
That's,
The public-
but that's even
that's-
more of a reason why
that's more-
you need checks and balances.
that's more the democracy, because a majority of the people voted for this.
That helps. I mean, the trigger
And
government
if they,
nature.
if they introduce something negative, they don't have to wait 3 years or
Right.
4 years or
Because
2
there's a
and a
no
half years.
confidence vote and they gone.
Yeah.
So that's actually a good thing as far as checks and balances go, because the ultimate check and balance is an election.
Yeah, but the trouble is, it's very unbalanced, because sometimes they have, every year, look at how many times Israel's had
well-
elections, because
To
they
get a
vote against
coalition.
someone, and also in England, they had
Yeah.
a prime minister that lasted a month,
Yeah. Yeah.
a woman, you know?
Yeah. But at least you're not stuck for, for years.
Yeah.
And you can, if there is.
I don't think they have do they have maybe a 6-year thing or something?
Yeah, there is a
Good,
term,
yeah.
but it's longer than our term, I think. And usually they get kicked out before then, so. I think
What else do
we're-
we have on our agenda that's worth discussing?
We've covered most things. We're almost out of time. But,
That's the biggest thing. If we could change anything,
yeah,
I would like to change
Vote.
time.
vote to
I'd
give
like
us
to
more
get more
time.
time, yeah. You said, what could Netanyahu have done to garner support prior to initiating his plan? Was this even possible? I think we discussed that.
Yep.
How should, before you call a vote, you should always see if you could get as much of the population behind you. How should Supreme Court justices in Israel be selected? Not the way they are, we covered that. What can Netanyahu now do to garner more support for his cabinet overhaul and lessen dissent? Clearly having a heart attack is not working. What should Israelis who disagree with the court changes do to protest? Well, they're doing it. I don't know what else they could do.
Well, meaning is striking the right thing to do if you're in the military.
No, they could protest
What form of
as you can
protest?
in
What's
a
the-
democracy.
What's a civil?
You go out
What's
to
a
the-
civil
You
disobedience?
go on, you march on the streets with flags. With
Right,
this.
but that's different from what some people are doing.
I know. No, but so
And then
far,
what do you do with
at
those
least in-
people?
at
You
least-
lock them up?
At least in
What
Israel.
do you do if the reservists don't show up? You gotta lock them up.
They will.
Yeah.
They have to, right.
Yeah.
But at least in Israel, even with the upheaval, there's been, unlike in this country, very few, if any, slaughters, and they all have military weapons because they all serve in the
Yeah.
service. So
That's like what happened, did not happen when they were giving the West Bank, not the Gaza back. People didn't want to leave, and the
Yeah.
U.S., the
They forced-
Israeli
yeah.
military had to literally drag people out
That's
of their
right.
homes.
and the people that
It's a
were
shame
dragged out.
when that happens, because
Right.
it's their own people, but you
Right.
gotta, it's the rule of law. You gotta have the rule of law.
Yeah, and it
even
was
if
the wrong thing because they didn't get any advantage doing it.
Yeah, but,
At least when they made peace with Egypt, they gave up the Sinai, miles and miles and miles of territory that they controlled, but it worked.
Yeah.
They had a real peace for now many, many years.
so. But, okay.
Does the internal unrest stemming from this overall pose a national security threat to Israel? It sure does. What should the U.S. do in reaction to the court overhaul? Well, I told you my view, that they should stay out of it because it's an internal, it's the people of the country that have to decide and not for us to dictate. As much as we'd like to, I'm sure we'd like to dictate changes in Iran, but they don't even let us go on their radio or television with our ideas. Term limits, number of justices, public elections. I think there should be term limits. They are elected for life, so at least they know they can't be, unless they do something very wrong. So they're not worried about the laws that they pass or they reject. So that's a good thing. But you still could have it with term limits. You say it could be a long-term limit. It could be 15 years or something. They say, well, then you lose. One of the arguments is you're losing the benefit of all that experience they have and so forth. But, 15 years is a pretty long time. And they still can serve as advise and consent to the Supreme, after they leave. They could have an advisory position. So giving people a lifetime, they stay too long, and then it becomes strategic, like they begged, who left recently? Breyer? Did Breyer leave? Yeah, I think Breyer left.
Yeah.
So they wanted him to resign so that Biden could appoint instead of waiting, and
Right.
if he...
Losing another one.
Yeah. So, and the same with
Well, that's why Ruth Bader Ginsburg was hanging on as long as
Yeah.
she could, but didn't make it.
Yeah.
But, all right, we're just about out of time. I thank you for
Thank you
having me
for
on.
joining us. You're always great.
Thank you.
We look forward to having you back again
I'm sure.
often. And to my wonderful listeners, my precious followers, not followers, I'm not the cult leader like I think Trump is seemingly trying to be, or already is, because no matter what he does, the people that are the MAGA people are totally dedicated and deny anything that he did anything wrong ever. So I think we had a discussion that at least should make you think.
Yep.
And if you have any thoughts, get in touch with me. Drop me an email or a call or anything, and I love to talk with you.
Okay.
Have a great week. God bless you all.
Thank
Bye.
you.